Hello everyone on Twitch. My name is Gabe Hollombe. I am a technical evangelist here at AWS, and I'm coming to you live from our office in Singapore. I'm joined in the room by my colleague Sean Ray, so he'll also be watching the chat during this stream for the next hour. And if I miss any questions or he thinks there's anything else relevant that he wants to call out, he might shout something out. So if you hear another voice, that's where that's coming from. So what are we going to do? Well, my hope is in the next hour, we'll live code a little example app to show off how to use AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL service in the cloud, to run a GraphQL endpoint to see how easy it is to get started using GraphQL on AWS. And we'll talk to it from a React app, React web app, and we'll use the AWS Amplify JavaScript library to make that very easy. So let me show you what we're going to build, and then we can kind of step through the different things we need to do to make it happen. So as you can see here, we've got a simple sign-in page. This is all customizable, of course, but out of the box, this is what we'll get as a default. So I'll just log in. And once I'm logged in, you'll see that, also I should call out there's a forgot password feature. There I can sign up if I haven't signed up yet. But once I'm signed up, I'll get a simple page that gives me a few options. I can sign out. I can fill out this little form to add a new event, or I can list a bunch of events. So the idea here in this stream is not to show you how to build beautiful apps with React. The goal is to show how to interact with the moving parts in terms of getting started with GraphQL and AppSync and whatnot. So forgive the fact that it's very bare bones. There's no styling involved here, really. That's not the point. So what we are going to do is going to build this simple event management app, right? And the idea is we can add new events here. So let's just add another one. We'll call it, I don't know, hello world, and I'll give a description. This is another event, and the where will be, I don't know, AWS, and the when, we'll just put it to, I don't know, tomorrow, doesn't matter. And if I click add event, I can't remember if I wired up subscriptions for this page or not. I might not have. Let's see. What if I refresh? Okay, so we'll actually get to that when I click out event, it even shows on the page as well. That involves subscriptions, which I didn't have at the time that I showed this earlier version of what we're going to build. But we'll get subscriptions in here also. Okay, so let's close that out and let's go ahead and get started. I like doing React, so I'm going to use create React app to give me a new app to start with. And I'll call this Innovate GraphQL 2, because I did this same session earlier, but this one is my second version of the stream. This shouldn't take very long to get going. If you haven't used Create React App before, it's a wonderful way to get started developing React apps. I strongly recommend it. Gives you a lot of different features out of the box, including like live reloading and some nice transpiling and support for modern JavaScript syntax and good things like that. Mostly I like it because it gives me live reloading and async await support out of the box. Okay, so if I go to Innovate GraphQL 2, which is the folder that Create React App created for me, I can just say npm start, and it should pop up in a browser window for me. I'm just going to move that all the way to the left. And there's our stock standard welcome to React page that we get from Create React App. Before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and just clean this up a little bit and kind of make it the most minimal amount of code that we need. And so we'll just leave that server running here. And at this moment, Zshell decides to take forever to start up. Really? That's interesting. Or my iTerm is deciding to all of a sudden freak out. That's very interesting. We'll just pop up in another one then. Yeah, that's fine. So here we go. We'll go to code, live coding, and Innovate GraphQL 2. And from here, I'll just open my editor. I'll full screen that. Let me know if the font size is okay or if you need me to adjust anything. And we'll just go into the app.js file here. I'm going to pull out some things we don't need. I'm not going to worry about styling for this, but I'll leave the CSS in there anyway. We'll pull out all this default stuff. We'll just start with an empty div, and we'll say, hello, AWS Innovate. If I save this, I will update Visual Studio Code later. If I save this and I refresh my page, I actually don't even need to refresh because it's refreshing the background. There we go. So we have a nice hello world set up, and it's a very good start. I'm going to go ahead and make a Git repo here for this. I'm not going to publish this repo to GitHub because I'm doing the same thing I just did in the previous stream, and there's no sense ending up with two repos that look exactly the same, or hopefully exactly the same. You'll be able to see this code at the end. I'll share the URL for the existing repo. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm just going to go ahead and make a commit. Hello world React. And these commits are really more just for my sake in case I totally mess something up and I want to get back to a fresh start. So that covers just starting up with React and getting the bare bones of what we need up and running for bootstrapping. If there's any questions, I'll catch them in the chat, but instead I'm going to move on. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add the authentication to this app. Now, it's a common thing you might want for all of your apps that you're building. And to get started with that, we're going to use a feature in AWS called AWS Mobile Hub. AWS Mobile Hub is a nice tool for managing cloud resources on AWS for your mobile and web apps. And instead of interacting with it here in the console, at the web console, I'm going to do it directly from the command line because I prefer that. And you can see that all I'll need to do is say AWS Mobile init. So this is AWS Mobile is it's a command line utility. I should also just show you how you can get started with that. The AWS Amplify talks also call it out in the quick start. So I've already created an app. I don't need to install Amplify because when I init my mobile app, it'll automatically do that. So there you go. You just npm install -g AWS Mobile CLI and configure it for the first time. I've already done that, and then you're good to go. So I'm just going to say AWS Mobile init for taking this directory and moving it under AWS Mobile's control for provisioning resources. I can accept all of these defaults. They work just fine with what Create React App makes for us. And we're going to give it a project name. I don't mind the default there. That's fine. It's just the name of my directory with the timestamp. In just a moment, I'm going to have a few resources provisioned for me automatically on AWS. Specifically, out of the box, it will give me a place where I can publish my React app to the web on S3, and it'll front that with CloudFront, our CDN, so users around the world will get a nice fast load experience. Cool. And just so we can keep going, the first thing I want to do now is I want to add authentication support. I can do this by saying AWS Mobile user sign in enable, and I'm going to do -P because I also want to control some of the settings here. I'm going to go to advanced settings. Now I've got a few different options. So these are all going to use Amazon Cognito, which is our service from AWS that lets you manage user signups and sign-ins, either by having users provide their own new set of credentials, that would be users that live in a user pool, or by using federated identity providers like Facebook or Google or other OIDC, that's OpenID Connect compatible providers, as well as enterprise SAML providers. But for this case, I'm just going to use a Cognito user pool because I'm going to have users sign up with their own username and password. Now I will require users to give us a username when they sign up. 8 characters default for minimum password length is fine, but I'm going to remove all of these. It's good to have these as requirements for your password, obviously, but for the purpose of this stream, I don't want to have to remember complicated passwords, so I'm going to turn those off. Oops, now git push, AWS Mobile push. So after doing that, all I have to do is say, all right, AWS Mobile, please take these configuration changes that I've added locally and affect them into the cloud. This is going to go ahead and provision a Cognito user pool, an identity pool for me behind the scenes. And what's really nice about this is it will also make it easy for our app to get temporary access credentials to AWS services like AppSync for when we want to interact with it, rather than having to embed like API keys into our app, which you certainly wouldn't want to do for a web app because in a web app all the JS that you're delivering can be viewable right in the browser for anyone who's loading your app. So instead, this can use Cognito to get temporary credentials for authenticated users to access whatever resources we need for our app. So now that that's done, we can, just to show you what that looks like on the back end, if I go back to Mobile Hub and I refresh, I've got a lot of ones in here, but we should have one for Innovate GraphQL too. There we go. So you can see a few things out of the, we got the hosting and streaming. I didn't have to turn that on. I also didn't have to turn on messaging analytics. That uses our Amazon Pinpoint service for doing things like tracking app analytics, like user sign-in and engagement, which you can then use to segment your users and follow up with them by sending push notifications or emails, etc. We're not going to use that in that stream, but it does come by default with apps that you turn on. Even if you don't use it, you don't need to worry about it. And user sign-in. And you can click on this resources link up here on any of your apps in Mobile Hub and see everything that Mobile Hub is managing on your behalf. So I could see the Cognito user pool. That'll be where my username and password shows up. I can see the identity pool where if I wanted to change things like what IAM role our identity and access management system will use in order to determine what access privileges users who are unauthenticated or authenticated will get. But we can leave the defaults alone. This also shows like what bucket our deployments are going to on S3 for for the and what our CloudFront distribution is for if we deploy this. And I'll try and end the stream by showing that as well. But anyway, now that we've done that, let me go ahead and show you some more documentation here on Amplify, because we're going to use the Amplify JavaScript library. This is an open source library that makes it easy to use declarative interactions for cloud resources, and it works great with AWS. And we'll go down here to the authentication section. Now, you can see here it talks about Cognito. I've already sort of covered the beginnings of that. So I did AWS Mobile Init, I did a user sign-in enable, I did a push. So here's what I'll need to do. I'll need to pull in a little bit of imports and then just tell Amplify where my configuration file lives. This is what you'll see here in the app. You'll see this AWS exports file that the AWS Mobile CLI created for us. And this is just all the config for our app that Amplify will use to do things without us having to teach it, where it should look for different cloud resources. So this file is managed automatically by AWS Mobile Hub within Mobile Hub, the AWS Mobile CLI. Anyway, let's go back to our app and let's add those other imports that we care about. And we don't need the comment, we can pull that out. So now that we've done that, if we just go back and you look a little bit more, there's different customization options we can do. You saw me walk through some of those. We don't need to change any other things. We don't need to do manual setup. Okay, so working with the API. So I'm going to show you a really easy turnkey way to add authentication, like the sign in, the sign up with one line of code. But if you don't like the defaults, you have quite a bit of control over what you can do using Amplify under the hood. For example, if you made your own UI, here's how you would use the auth library from Amplify in order to affect sign-in confirmations, sign-ups, etc. But you'll notice down here there's a using with authenticator HOC. So HOC means higher order component. In React, these are components that generally take other components in as inputs and do something with them. And what we're going to do is we're going to import that as well, and then just wrap our React app class inside this with authenticator, and you'll see what happens. It's pretty cool. So we'll add one more import there. Again, I'll just remove the comment because I don't care about the comment. And we're going to say with authenticator. Now I'm going to add one more piece of config here, which is include greetings true. And what that'll do is give us a nice sign out option as well. Now I don't just know that from magic, it's just right down here in the documentation. I'll skip the federated identity points. You can see rendering a sign out button. Here you go. So if you add include greetings true, you'll get a nice sign out button. So now that I've done that, if we reload the app, you can see here we're already at a sign in screen. So first off, I'm going to have to sign up in order to create an account. I'll say Gabe. I'll give it a password. I'll type my email address in. And oops. And I do have to give it a password, or a phone number, even though we're not going to use it here. I'm just going to put something as an example, 5551212, and I'll click sign up. I'm not going to show you guys my real phone number as much as I'll love you on Twitch. And what I should then get is a code that is emailed to me, the address I've provided. And that's to prove that I own the account so that I could use that forget password functionality if I need it. So I'll just pop over to my email on a screen here and wait for a second. There's my verification code. You guys can't see this because you don't need to look at my inbox. But here we go. There's the code that I got. And now I will just click confirm. And now I should be able to sign in using the username and password that I provided. And now if I ever forget my password, I should be able to retrieve it again. Great, so there we are, back again. Hello AWS Innovate, but now I've got my hello Gabe at the top and I can click sign out. And if I refresh, then it'll automatically log me back into my app. So that's cool. Now we've got our app under the control of Cognito pretty easily. Oh, thanks, Melon Lord. I'm glad that you love me too. That's very nice. So let's go on and just do a commit now because we have a nice, well, I'll show you what did we change. We changed a bit, but the only things that were really interesting were we AWS Mobile-ified this directory, and then we added Cognito for authentication. Init AWS Mobile and add auth. Cool. I will try and watch the chat also to see if there are any questions coming up, or Sean can let me know if there's any questions that I miss. Yes, Mr. Gibby, it's a rerun of what I did earlier today. Although hopefully I'll be able to get through without a fire alarm. In the last live stream, a fire alarm went off in the last 15 minutes of the stream, and that kind of distracted me a little bit, so we'll see how far I get this time. Hopefully no typos. Okay, so moving on, we've gone and added authentication. We can sign up, we can sign in to our app, but we can't do we don't have any data retrieval yet. So now's the time to move and talk about GraphQL. What is GraphQL? Why do I think it's worth talking about, and how do we use it? Well, the place I started learning about GraphQL was on the graphql.github.io page. It's also just at graphql.org/learn. I think that just redirects here. Let's see, graphql.org/learn. Yep, that just redirects here. And I really like the language that they use here in this middle paragraph. So GraphQL is a query language for your API and a server-side runtime for executing queries using a type system you define for your data. GraphQL is not tied to any specific database or storage engine and is instead backed by your existing code and data. So again, just to unpack that a little bit, a common misconception I hear a lot from people is they think GraphQL has something to do with graph databases. It doesn't. You can use graph databases with GraphQL, but there's no requirement to do so. GraphQL is basically just a specification that says, here is how clients should ask for data from an API, from a server. And it's a strongly typed specification that's defined using a schema definition language that basically says, here are the data types that can be exchanged, and here are the queries that the client is allowed to ask for, and here are the mutations that the client is allowed to effect against that API. That's it. It's up to you to implement the GraphQL service and whatever programming language and data storage technologies you want. Now, if you're interested in working with GraphQL, I hope I can convince you to check out Amazon or AWS AppSync. It is a great service that is it's a managed GraphQL endpoint that we host for you. So if you don't want to use that, you're probably going to Dockerize your own GraphQL server that you're going to write, but then you're going to have to manage the scalability and the security of that. And why not delegate that undifferentiated heavy lifting to AWS so you can focus more on building your API and less on the high availability, scalability, and security of it. Let AWS worry about that. And that's what what AppSync is all about. So let's add that to our app, and then I'll go ahead and show you what it looks like in the console first. So let's say AWS Mobile AppSync enable. Can I just configure it here with -p? Let's see. Yep, so I want to I want to use Cognito user pools because I already set up Cognito for authentication. And I can just hit enter. So the AWS Mobile CLI is smart enough to know what Cognito resource was already provisioned and use that as the default for me there. Cool, and now I'll just go ahead and push that. In a second, we'll have a nice example mobile application, a simple schema with AWS AppSync already provisioned. When you're learning how to do something new, I always find it's better to start with example code rather than a blank slate and have to read a bunch of documentation to figure out how to get going. And luckily, the creators of AppSync also felt that way. And so when you create a new API in AppSync, you have the choice of getting a default schema to work with where things are automatically wired up for you and you can see how it works and get your feet wet, or you can start with a blank slate where you can define your own types, and you can still auto-generate resources like DynamoDB tables or Elasticsearch to have those data types bound to. So AppSync makes a lot of things very easy for you, but out of the box, for this demo, we're going to go ahead and just use the default example schema that it provisions. And that's what you can see is happening right now. So it's creating some resolvers now. What a resolver is the way that GraphQL takes the data types that your client is requesting to fetch or to mutate, and it's what says, here's how you should affect some side effect and some data storage for that data type. Okay, if we're done retrieving, we should be done in 1 second. Cool. Here we go.
I noticed as that was going that it was building a DynamoDB table in the background.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
I can totally talk about that. So in case the microphone didn't pick that up, Sean said, I also noticed that the DynamoDB table got provisioned during that. What's that all about? So let's go look. So from the AWS Web Console here, you can type AppSync, you can type GraphQL, but whatever you do, come over and to hit the AppSync console. Make sure you're in the right region. Here I am. Here's my API for this. And let's take a look. So before we get into looking at the schema and stuff, let me just show you what's powering this under the hood. So it provisioned 2 example tables for me in DynamoDB. DynamoDB is our NoSQL data service. It's used for, it's basically a key value store, but all of your values don't have to have the same schema structure, so it's schemaless, and it supports global secondary indexes, so you can do search operations by more than just whatever your primary key on the table is, and it's really fast. It's made for consistently quick reads and writes at scale. And I think it works very nicely along with GraphQL and AppSync. So it makes sense that it's a nice default. I'll show you what the tables look like. I mean, you can just click here and you can see. It won't look like much, so we'll come back to it in a minute. But let's go ahead and look at the example schema that it created for us. So all GraphQL schemas at their root have to have this bit of syntax here where it says schema, and then inside here, you're going to at least have queries, probably, or maybe you'll only have mutations, but you're probably going to have queries and mutations. I'll come back and I'll talk about subscriptions towards the end of the feed. So queries look like this. In this case, they are of type query. So what are the queries that we get out of the box with this example schema? We get a get event. So this will let us fetch an event by a particular ID, or we could list events. Now you'll notice sometimes we see an exclamation mark and sometimes we don't. The exclamation mark means it is a required field type. And if there are no exclamation marks, we can see these are optional. So I can call the list events query without passing a limit or a next token, and I'll just get back whatever this event connection type is. What's an event connection? So an event connection is a data type that just has items, which is a list of 0 or more events, and a next token, which is a string. And this will let us do pagination based on the results of a DynamoDB scan operation. So event connection, as I said, returns a list of events. What is an event? Well, here an event is simply an object that has an ID. These are going to be UUIDs in the system, and that's required. And then we've got name, where, when, and description, all as strings. We can also do nested relations, so you can say that an event has comments. Similarly, you can think of this as like the top level list events query. On each event, you've got comments, which returns a comment connection, which looks the same, is of the same shape. We're just going to worry about events for the purpose of the stream, so we don't need to look at comments. But it's nice to call out that AppSync and GraphQL support nested relationships. In fact, that's why it's called GraphQL, because oftentimes our data is a tree of relationships, right? And so you can query down through that in order to get the data you want. And I'll talk about that more in just a second. So let's now look at the query section of the AppSync console. So you define your schema, and that's all well and good, but how do you interact with it? Well, you can do it from code, and we're going to get to that, but it's also nice at first to do it from the API. Now, here we can see that I'm not logged in here because remember we said from Cognito that we want to use Cognito user pools for our authentication, and so the console here is going to ask me to go ahead and log in. So I'm going to need a client ID, a username, and a password. Well, my user ID and my password are what I registered for my app. And for client ID, I can pull that directly from my AWS exports from right here, our user pool's client ID. So if I do that, now I've got a nicely logged in client. We can see if this works in a second. I'll just run a query here. And then I'll walk you through what I'm saying here in just a second. And that should work. Great. Okay. So we also have a nice documentation browser here. If you have worked with GraphQL before, you've probably used a tool called Graphicool. That's GRAPHICOOL. Sometimes they pronounce it graphical. It's a nice UI for interacting, exploring your GraphQL endpoints and affecting queries and mutations and browsing documentation. And this is all browsable too, so I can see what queries can I do. I can make a list event query where I could optionally pass limit or next token. I get back an event connection, which of course has items of type event. And what you can see here is, so I said, I want to run the list events query. I'm not passing any arguments to that. And then from that, I can specify only the fields I care about, like ID, maybe ID and name. So the client gets to decide what data it wants back. Now you'll notice it doesn't matter because we haven't created anything yet. So whatever I type here, I'm still not getting back any events. So I'm going to go ahead and create an event, and then we can see that how these changing what you're asking for changes the shape of the result. So I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call this all events. And that's just so that I can have multiple queries here or mutations. I can choose which one I want to run. So I'll make a mutation called new event, and that will be of type create event. And I have to specify a lot of different fields here. I'm going to put this on separate lines because I think it reads better. Let me give us a little bit more space here. Okay, so I need to give it a name. So we'll call this AWS Innovate 2018. If I can type right. Cool. The where is online. The when is, well, depending on where you're tuning in from, but for me, the date today is the 19th, and I'll give it a description. It's a great place to learn. And if I run this, and I can do it with a keyboard shortcut, oh, hang on, I can't run it yet. I need to specify what data I want back. So just like queries, mutations also need to specify what data they want back. For instance, I'll say, give me the ID of the newly created event. I can run this with a keyboard shortcut, or I could come up here and I can just click run my new event mutation. There we go, we got back an ID. And so again, if I come back down here and I just run my list events query again, there it is. And you can see I got back ID and name because that's all I asked for. If I say I want ID, name, and description, I'll only get back those. And so this addresses one really nice point about GraphQL is, especially for mobile applications or web apps too, it gives you the ability for the client to declare exactly what they want or what they need in order to render the parts of the UI that they're concerned with. Versus, let's say in the olden days where we built a ton of REST apps, and I've built a lot of REST APIs, you would have to decide ahead of time, what does your resource response look like? And oftentimes we might not need all of the fields that are returned in a particular resource response. So GraphQL can let you say, I want this event, I only want the name and the description, but I also want the comments, but from the comments, I only want the person's name, or I only want the comment body or the date, right? Like you can navigate that whole structure and only ask for what you need. So let me just make one more so we can see that we've got two things in here, just because I think that's kind of fun. So we can say like Unix's birthday. That was at AT&T. And I'll just say 1970, 01. Happy Unix. Fine. Okay. So now we've got two events in our system. But where are they stored? I haven't showed you that yet, right? I told you they were in DynamoDB, but how does this work? I think it's worth unpacking for just a second. So in AppSync, you can specify different data sources. And you've got a few different options here. So you can choose a DynamoDB type, and so it'll persist our data to DynamoDB. We can also use Elasticsearch. So if we have more complicated search needs than what we can do with the queries that are supported by Dynamo, we could use Elasticsearch, so maybe some fuzzy searching or maybe some geospatial queries. Elasticsearch is great for that. You can also say, I want to resolve my data using a Lambda function. Now this is extremely powerful because it lets you basically do anything, right? You can run a Lambda function, and that Lambda function could go out and query a RDS database like Postgres or MySQL or Aurora. It could just pull data from some hard-coded file. It could do whatever you want. And that can be written in any language. We're also rolling out support for HTTP resolvers. So that'll let you say, I have an existing REST endpoint already. Please just call out to that endpoint for this data type. So that's pretty neat. But let me show you exactly how it works here. So if we look at the AppSync event table, actually not the table, we got to go to the schema here. On the right-hand side, we can see all these different resolvers. Let me give us more space again. All these different field types and the resolvers. And I want to go and let's just look at the create event mutation here and what this resolver looks like. So really quickly, it says I want to use the AppSync event table data source, which we know is DynamoDB. And this might look a little unusual to you, but this is because instead of using the Lambda data type, which will just pass our data to Lambda for us to do whatever we want with, we're leveraging the fact that AppSync has a tight integration with Dynamo. And if you give it a template in a particular format, you're telling AppSync basically to do a DynamoDB API call for you. And you're just sort of templatizing some data into that API call. In this case, it's a put item operation where the ID should be of type string, and we're going to use this utility function, auto ID, which will give us a UUID. And then here from our mutation, which took different arguments in, like name, where, when, and description, we're just putting all of those out into similarly named attributes there that'll go and get lined into the put operation for DynamoDB. And then what we return back to AppSync, and therefore back to the client, will just be the result of that API call from Dynamo, which we're going to just convert to JSON and hand back. And just to show you what that looks like now that we've created some, you can see them in here in the DynamoDB console and what the data looks like there. So that's great. We kind of got a rundown of AppSync, but we haven't used it yet in our app. So let's wire that together. So going to the back to the Amplify docs, if you go to the API section, you can see that there's a number of options for working with REST, but we're interested in GraphQL here. So we're going to have to do a little bit more configuration. Luckily, we don't have to do this because it's already done because we did it for the other thing. And you can see here, because we did AppSync enable and AppSync configure, we've already done this import. We're good to go. We already have that AppSync configuration in there. We could also do a manual configuration, but we don't need to do that. So we can skip ahead. Now, you'll notice that there are a number of options here. So in the simplest case, working with the GraphQL client from Amplify is very easy. You can define a string, right? The string looks very similar to what we were working with in the console. And from this string, you're just going to basically pass it to a method that we have. So here's an example. Here's two different examples. So we're importing API and GraphQL operation from the Amplify library. There's list events, which is just a simple query with no arguments templatized into it. And here we've got get event, which has an ID and a next token slotted in. And this is how it passes them from the name of the query into the actual query syntax that GraphQL is expecting. And then here we're just, again, describing like what we want to fetch. And the way you get the data back is it's an asynchronous call, but luckily we can use the async and await style syntax here. So we can say api.graphql, and you pass it this value. And the value is the result of calling the GraphQL operation function and giving it either just the string or the string plus an object with the variables that you want to templatize into that query. And then, again, that's an asynchronous operation that returns a promise. And once that data is returned, in this case, it's just logging it. Now, we could do that, but there's something even easier we can do. And that's because we're using React, and there's a React component built for us already that does some even nicer things. Basically, we'll handle running our query when our component loads. So let me pull this in. This is just from the example documentation here. I think I pulled one too many curly braces, so let me just try this again. Let's pull that into our app. So we'll get rid of our hello world hard-coded render. And instead, reading this backwards, we're going to do the following. We're going to use this connect component, which also I have to import before I forget. So hang on, let me do that. And I'll walk us through the code. So a couple more imports that I will also need to probably consolidate. So Amplify, we've already got imported, but we're going to add GraphQL operation. And then from our AWS Amplify React, we're going to take with Authenticator and also connect. Cool. So going back down, what are we doing here? We're using the connect higher order component and passing in a query. A query is just a result of calling GraphQL operation on our list events. List events is just a hard-coded query string here that asks for items with names and descriptions. And what it's going to do with that is the connect component will it'll handle fetching the data and then running the function that we give it inside of here, right? So this is a little hard to read though, because it's doing 2 levels of destructuring here. So I'm just gonna change this a little bit. I'm gonna change it like this. So I know that the function returned can take the following. It can take, or it provides rather data. It expects an object, a flag for if it's loading data or not. And also it can take in errors. Sean is waving to me. Hang on, Sean, I'll be right with you. Let me just clean this up. All right, what's your question, Sean?
So Melon Lord 5 asks in the chat about what's the difference between Amplify and AppSync?
Got it.
And maybe we should explain it for all the users watching.
Perfect. Thank you, Melon Lord 5. That's a great question. So AWS Amplify is a JavaScript library that makes it easy to work with all different kinds of cloud services on AWS especially. And as you can see here, there's a documentation here about working with REST. This has nothing to do with GraphQL or or AppSync. There's a bit about doing analytics for your app. The authentication we did, that was with Cognito. That has nothing to do with AppSync, etc. So there are a number of different declarative style of functions that you might want to use in your React or React Native or web APIs, so I should say clients that you're building, and AWS Amplify makes those really easy to do. Push notifications, there's caching, there's a lightweight pub sub, etc. So Amplify is just a JavaScript library that I think is really great, and it makes working with a lot of things easy, including AppSync. AppSync is our managed GraphQL endpoint service in the cloud on AWS. Hopefully that helps answer the question. Cool. So looking at the code again, I'm just changing the destructuring to be only 1 level, but I know that what the connect component will do is call our function and pass in a few things. It'll pass in an object with data if data is ready for us, a loading flag if we're loading data, errors if there are any errors from the queries and mutations that we're doing. And I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to say if we're loading, then I don't need the braces. I'm just going to say return a div that says loading. And we'll say if errors.length is greater than 0, so errors will always exist. It'll just be an array that's either empty or has some errors in it. Then I will return a div that just JSON stringifies my errors. This is just mostly for if I have any problems when I'm developing. You would probably want to do something a little bit different in a production app. Finally, I'll say if we don't have any data on our list events option or piece of data inside data, which is what we would get from here because that's what we called it in our query. So if there's nothing there, I'm just going to return. And if we get down this far after all of these guard clauses, then we're good to just say, then just return my list view where I pass in data.listEvent.items. List view is just another little function component here that takes in a list of events and gives us a nice little header and then maps over each of those events and outputs a list item that has a name and an ID in parentheses. And the event ID is also used as a key so that React doesn't complain about list items with without different key properties. If I save this and I go back to our app, there it is. I'll refresh so we can see the little loading flag. Hopefully we can see that there. It says loading and then it loads the events. So that was pretty great. Without a lot of code, we've wired up our front end now to pull data from the AppSync GraphQL API. So that's for reading. I'll go ahead and make a quick commit and then we'll do one for writing. Cool. Okay, so for writing, I'm going to go ahead and in the interest of time, just paste in something that I wrote beforehand, and I'll walk you through the code involved, but that way you don't have to watch me type a bunch of things that are actually pretty simple. So just give me a sec. I'm pulling this from another window. Okay, so we have our app class. I'm going to make another class here, and I'm just pasting it all in one document because we're just live coding here. We're not doing really nice app organization. So let's add an event form. So event form is going to start with an empty state, but it'll keep track of name, description, where and when. And then if we just go back and we look at the rest of it in reverse order, we can see that what we're going to do is we're going to render some input elements with different names for name, description, where and when. And then when they change, we'll fire our handle change function. We'll also have a add event button that will fire our add event handler. So what does handle change do? It's just going to start with an empty JavaScript object, and then we're going to pull we're going to set the name property of that, or we're going to pull the name property out of the field that changed, put that in our object with the value equal to the value of what we typed, and we're going to use that object to just call React set state to update the state. Then what is add event going to do? Well, here it's going to just mutate. It's going to send the mutation. This looks really similar to what we did in the console before, but here we're also just templatizing in and putting different arguments, basically name, where, when, and description, and those are going to get mapped through exactly like we did for our create event, where before we just hard-coded them, but now they're coming through as variables. And we'll pull back all the information about the event that we created. So then we're going to say await the API.graphql, where we call create event with this.state, because this.state is just those 4 attributes, right? It's an object that has the 4 attributes we care about templatizing into this query, or this mutation rather. We'll log event created, and then we'll reset our state so that things look good. We can type another one if we want. API is not defined. Yep, I missed an import. So we're going to add API as another import. I forgot to also add event form to my apps render. So let's do that. So now we've got our form. So we can add another one. We'll just say hello, foo, bar, baz. We don't really care about these fields for the purpose of the stream. And I'll click add event. And hopefully in the console, we can see event created object. Yes, good. So we haven't done subscriptions yet, so we're not seeing the data refresh. But if I refresh the page, there it is. So that was pretty easy, actually. And the hardest part here from a hard perspective in terms of lines of code was really just writing all the React stuff involved in order to put a form on the page, manage the state for that form in a nice fashion. But in terms of interacting with GraphQL, it was pretty simple, right? All we needed to do was create an asynchronous function to handle adding the event, right? Which is what we called with our state. So it's basically capture your mutation, use the Amplify JS library to call API.graphql with your mutation, passing in the name of the mutation plus the string rather containing that whole mutation expression plus the state or some object with your variables, and then you're good to go. So I will make a commit here. So this is adding events done. And I'm just going to quickly check the chat and see how we're going. Yeah, that was easy. Thanks, Melon Lord. I agree. Yeah, pretty cool. So now let's do subscriptions. I promised you subscriptions, and we've got 10 minutes left. So subscriptions it is. Let's first look at the docs back in Amplify so you can see how to use them there, and then we'll work backwards from there into what changes we need to make to leverage that. So we'll go back to API. We'll say working with GraphQL and also using GraphQL client. And we already looked at queries. We can scroll down. We can see there's a section on subscriptions. So subscriptions work very similarly. They shouldn't be very surprising. You create a string that describes the subscription you want. And if there's any arguments for that subscription, subscriptions are like queries. So they can take arguments, but you don't need to give them any. In our case, we're just going to subscribe to all events that are created. We won't pass any arguments. And then you're going to create a subscription and then call .subscribe, which will start listening for new events. And what should it do when it gets a new event? Well, you can pass it a function for what it should do. And then if you're cleaning something up, you can call unsubscribe on that subscription to stop listening. But your life can be even easier, right? So back in the React components section, in addition to queries, we can also do subscriptions. And so to do that, all we need to do is give it a subscription and an on subscription message property. with appropriate values in there. And so that's what we'll do now. And again, just so you don't have to watch me type a whole lot of stuff, I'm going to pull that in from a demo I ran earlier, because I'd rather end successfully than spend time hunting down a typo. But I'll walk you through it, and it should hopefully feel pretty comfortable. Okay, so first I'm just going to take two more. So just like we have our list events string there for our query, I'm going to add in a subscribe to new event string that says it's got a subscription. I'm calling it new events. It's going to use the subscribe to event subscription, which we'll set up in AppSync in a second, and we'll listen for all of these. We'll listen for all of these fields back from it. And what we'll do for our on new subscription is we'll call this handle new event data method, which effectively is going to do the following. Your handler here needs to, it gets the previous data that was fetched from the connect component, and it gets an object with the data from the new subscription, and you just need to mutate and return a new object of the same shape as the first query that happened, and give it the basically the new data smushed into the existing data. If you want to just kind of re-render the component with everything, right? The old stuff plus the new. You could do all kinds of things, but this kind of use case works well for what I want to do, which is effectively just kind of refresh the component with all of the different event names whenever we get a subscription about a new change. And so we'll just need to add those down here like the documentation shows. So I'm going to add, so for subscription, I'm going to say that's a GraphQL operation where I pass in the subscribe to new events, and on subscription message, which is the other property according to the documentation, I'm just going to say handle new event data. Okay, so this won't work yet because we have to teach AppSync about this subscription. So let's go look at that. If we go back to our schema, the default example schema gives the subscription, but it's not what we want. This is about subscribing to comments for a particular event. Instead, I just want to say subscribe to event. And actually, I think I decided I wanted to call it subscribe to new events. Subscribe to event is what the name there is. Okay, cool. So subscribe to the event is what comes here. And what I want to do is trigger that. That returns an event, not a comment. What I want to do is say, using this AWS subscribe annotation, I'm going to say, whenever the create event mutation fires, I want it to publish to anyone listening to this subscribe to event subscription. Oops, why am I clicking save there? I want to click it down here. So now that I've added that as a valid subscription to the schema, if we come back and I refresh our page here, and pop up in the console in case we have any errors, we can just watch. Well, let's go ahead and just try and type one of these in. I'll just say foo, bar, baz, quux. And if I've done this right, when I click add event, look, it showed up. Hooray, high five, everybody. So we didn't have to refresh or anything, but it gets even cooler. And in the last few minutes of the stream, let me just show that. How this is working is it's opening a WebSocket connection to AppSync behind the scenes. And this is made for huge scalability, right? So you can have a whole ton of subscribers listening for different events. AppSync was designed to scale really well in that regard. But I want to show another change happening so we can see this. Maybe I can do it by splitting my screen. Let's see. I can get rid of the console here, and I can pull my AppSync to a different side of the screen. Okay, so let's go back and let's actually just make a change here, because it could have come from a different client, and that client even includes here, right? I could have done it from another browser window, but I'll just do it right here, and we'll just say subscription test, and the rest of these things don't matter, but just for the sake of it, we'll just change some of it. Okay, now when I run this, hopefully it will also, let me just say, I also want to pull back the name, the winner, the when, and the description. Actually, I probably don't need all those because I'm not showing them here. I'm only showing name here, but just in case, I'll put them there because I think it makes more sense. Let's run this and let's see. Hopefully, it'll show up here in our other app. There you go. So that's really neat, and that sort of shows that subscriptions are not just for listening to stuff that you're doing yourself, but are also, of course, really valuable for finding out when changes are happening out of band from the current client, either from other clients or somewhere. That's pretty powerful. I encourage you to look into this a little bit more if you'd like more information on this. We're getting towards the end of the stream. I'm going to end by specifically calling out, I've shown a lot of the documentation for Amplify. We haven't looked at any of the documentation for AppSync yet, so let me just show you what some of that looks like so it's not so foreign when you first go look at it. There's a ton of documentation here, and it's really well worth the read to get going. There's a lot of stuff here. There's a nice GraphQL overview here. There's information about designing GraphQL APIs. There's tutorials for building a client app. You can look at. You can follow here for building a React.js app, for example. That'll be very similar to what I've done in this stream. But of course, you can use AppSync and GraphQL with React Native, with Node, with iOS, with Android. It's agnostic to your client. We also provide AppSync SDKs for iOS and Android as well as React Native. And there's nice things in there for handling caching and doing conflict resolution as well. I haven't had time to show that off in the stream, but it's well worth a look if that sounds interesting to you. If you wanted to know more about, for example, the mapping templates that I was doing, I remember when I showed that template. It's using a language called VTL, which stands for Velocity Templating Language. It's an open source Apache project. But you can see here, for example, what did I know? What was the shape of what I could put in that template for put item? It looks like this. And then there's more information about what conditions you can do down here, etc. You can learn more about condition expressions. If I wasn't doing a put item, but maybe I wanted to do a query and search against the DynamoDB index for certain things, here's everything I can use for that template. And again, you don't have to use DynamoDB if you don't want to, but if you do, what's nice is you're not paying for any, not that it costs a lot, but you don't have the overhead of using a Lambda function or even the milliseconds of duration that the Lambda function takes to execute in order to resolve your field. When you're using the DynamoDB resolvers, for example, AppSync just does that for you. So it's less moving parts and it's also less of a bill. So that about wraps it up. We've got 2 minutes to go. I'm just going to scan the chat and see if there's any other questions. Melon Lord, I'm really glad that you got a lot out of this stream. That makes me very happy. Thank you so much for all of your positive comments there. Cool. All right. Well, with that, with a minute to go, I'm just going to go ahead and sign off. Say thank you very much. Let me show one more thing before we go, and that is where to get this.
So Aravind has asked about 3 times, and I missed it. Sorry. Which Vim plugin are you using for VS Code?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll show that too. So here's the library. Here's the repo where I've just done this earlier today. If you want to follow along and see the code that I've done here, it's again, it's really just a lot of documentation stitched together from. It's code stitched together from some relevant documentation. So between the Amplify docs, the AppSync docs, and this repository here, it should hopefully be enough to get you started. And to answer your question, what Vim extension am I using for Visual Studio? I am using, where are you? Oh, hang on, you can't see that. Let me click here. I am using this one, the VS Code Vim, which I think is pretty great. It's certainly good enough. I still use Vim a lot, but I've tended to use VS Code a lot more as my go-to editor at first. And if I get really frustrated with something, I'll switch to Vim. But yeah, it's a great extension. I recommend it. It feels pretty natural. It even does things like macros. It's really nice in that way. And we're just now at an hour, so I do have to sign off and say thanks again for all of your support and for being such a great audience. And I hope to catch you again sometime on Twitch. See ya.